Cycle breaker. When loving them becomes losing yourself. Breaking the pattern of making another person's addiction the center of our entire life. Welcome back to Healing Both Sides. I'm Christina Fox. We're continuing our Cycle Breaker series, where we're looking honestly at the patterns that can travel through families and generations, and what it takes for us to finally say, "This stops with me." Some of these conversations will speak more directly to addiction and recovery. Some will speak more to the people who love someone struggling with addiction, and many will speak to both. But I want to make something clear as we move through this series. Cycle breaking isn't just about addiction. These conversations can apply to anyone's life. Maybe addiction isn't part of your story at all. Maybe your cycle is unhealthy relationships, poor boundaries, or never being taught boundaries in the first place, childhood trauma, abandonment, abuse, neglect, people-pleasing, anger, silence, constantly rescuing other people, avoiding difficult conversations, or simply repeating behaviors you watched growing up because nobody ever showed you another way. We all have patterns. Some were handed down to us. Some we learned by watching the people around us. Some developed because we were trying to survive what was happening in our lives. And some we repeated for so long that we don't even recognize them as patterns anymore. That's why breaking cycles isn't about finding someone to blame. It's about being willing to look honestly at what we inherited, what we learned, what we've experienced, and even the patterns we've created ourselves, and deciding what we no longer want to carry forward. So wherever you're coming from, I want you to listen for your cycle. Because you don't have to have addiction in your story to recognize that something in your life needs to change. And some of these conversations may be uncomfortable. That's okay. We're going to talk about the things people and families sometimes don't talk about. We're going to have compassion for where these patterns came from while still holding ourselves accountable for what we do with them now. Because we may not have started the cycle, but we can decide what happens next. Today, we're talking about when loving them becomes losing yourself. There's something that can happen when you love someone struggling with addiction that nobody really prepares you for. At first, you're worried about them. That's normal. Someone you love is struggling. Of course you're worried. So you check on them. You try to help. You start looking for answers. You learn about treatment. You search for resources. You try to figure out what they're using, where they're going, who they're with, whether they're safe. And somewhere along the way, without making a conscious decision to do it, their life can become the center of yours. You wake up thinking about them. You go to sleep thinking about them. Your mood depends on what they're doing. If they're doing well, you can breathe. If they're not doing well, your entire world feels like it's falling apart. If the phone rings at 2 a.m, your heart jumps. If you haven't heard from them, you worry. If you do hear from them, sometimes you worry even more. You analyze their voice, their texts, their behavior. You try to figure out if they're telling the truth. You start looking for signs. Are they using? Are they sober? Where are they? Who are they with? Why haven't they answered? And eventually you realize something. You aren't living your life anymore. You're monitoring theirs. How do we get here? I think this is important because loved ones can be judged pretty harshly for this. People say, "Stop worrying about them. Just let them go. You can't control them." And technically, they're right. But when it's someone you love, especially your child, those words can feel almost ridiculous. Because we're not talking about somebody forgetting to pay their electric bill. We're sometimes talking about life and death. We're talking about overdoses, car accidents, violence, jail, homelessness, medical emergencies, disappearing, mental health crises, things that can have permanent consequences. So yes, we become afraid. And fear changes how we behave. One crisis happens and we respond. Then another happens. And another. Eventually our brain starts anticipating the next one. We become alert to everything. The phone, the time, their tone of voice, a missed call, a strange message, silence, and sometimes even when nothing is happening. We're waiting for something to happen. That's exhausting. Love and fear start getting tangled together. This is where it becomes difficult to recognize what's happening. Because we're doing these things because we love them. At least that's how it begins. But eventually love and fear can become so tangled together that we don't know which one is driving us anymore. We tell ourselves, I'm doing this because I love them. But sometimes underneath that is, I'm terrified of what will happen if I don't. And those are not always the same thing. Sometimes we aren't helping because the help is actually useful. We're helping because doing something makes us feel less helpless. Calling, searching, paying, fixing, investigating, lecturing, checking, planning, finding another treatment center, making another appointment, trying one more thing, because sitting still and admitting, I cannot control what happens next, can be terrifying. Sometimes doing something for them gives us temporary relief from our own fear. That's uncomfortable to admit, but cycle breaking requires honesty. Your life starts getting smaller. This usually doesn't happen overnight. Nobody wakes up and says, starting today, I'm going to stop having my own life. It happens little by little. You cancel dinner because there's a crisis. You stop going somewhere because you're afraid something will happen while you're gone. You stop answering friends because you're tired of explaining what's going on. You don't take the trip. You don't spend the money on yourself because they might need it. You don't sleep. You don't relax. You don't celebrate things fully because they're struggling. Maybe you stop taking care of your health. Your marriage suffers. Other children get less of you. Friendships disappear. Things you once enjoyed don't feel important anymore. And eventually someone asks, what do you like to do? And you don't even know. Because for so long your life has revolved around someone else's crisis. And then comes the guilt. This is a big one. Sometimes loved ones feel guilty for being okay when the person they love isn't. How can I go out and enjoy myself when my child is homeless? How can I take a vacation when they're in jail? How can I buy something for myself when they're struggling? How can I laugh when I don't even know where they are? How can I sleep peacefully when they might not have somewhere safe to sleep? It can feel wrong to experience joy while somebody you love is suffering. So we punish ourselves right along with them. They aren't enjoying life, so neither are we. But I want us to really think about that. Does our suffering make them safer? Does our sleeplessness make them sober? Does canceling our plans stop them from using? Does refusing to enjoy our lives change their choices? Usually no. Now there are two people suffering, and sometimes an entire family. Your pain is not proof of your love. You do not have to destroy your life to prove that someone else's life matters to you. For the person struggling with addiction, I want you to hear this too. This isn't being said to make you feel guilty. That's not what healing both sides is about. I want you to understand something that you may not have been able to see while you were deep in addiction. Sometimes the people who loved you weren't trying to control you simply because they wanted power over you. Sometimes they were terrified. They may have seen things you didn't see. They may have gotten calls you don't remember making. They may have stayed awake while you slept. They may have searched hospitals, checked jail rosters, driven neighborhoods, called your friends, watched your breathing, waited outside bathrooms, kept their phone beside them all night. And sometimes they became controlling. Sometimes they crossed lines. Sometimes they made decisions they shouldn't have made. Sometimes their fear became unhealthy too. Understanding why doesn't automatically make every behavior okay, but it helps us understand each other. The person struggling may have been thinking, why won't everybody get off my back? While the loved one was thinking, I'm trying to keep you alive. Two completely different experiences happening inside the same addiction. That's why we need both sides of the conversation. But fear cannot become our permanent way of living. Loved ones, this is where our responsibility begins. We cannot control whether someone uses. We cannot control whether they go to treatment. We cannot control whether they stay in treatment. We cannot control whether they relapse. We cannot control whether they tell the truth. We cannot control whether they take recovery seriously. And accepting that can feel horrible. Because if we aren't controlling those things, Who is? They are. And sometimes nobody is. That's the part we don't want to face. Because accepting that someone has the freedom to make a destructive choice means accepting that we may not be able to stop the consequences. But trying to control the uncontrollable doesn't actually give us control. It gives us exhaustion. We can become addicted to the outcome. I don't mean addiction in the clinical sense. I'm talking about becoming completely emotionally dependent on one particular outcome. They have to get better before I can be okay. Think about how much power is contained in that sentence. If they get sober, I can live. If they go to treatment, I can breathe. If they call me, I can sleep. If they stop seeing that person, I'll feel better. If they get a job, I'll stop worrying. If they finally understand what they're doing to us, I'll have peace. Our peace becomes conditional. And the condition is, someone else has to change. That's an impossible place to live. Because now our emotional well-being belongs to someone whose own life may be completely unstable. Loving someone is not the same as living their life. This is one of the hardest lessons. I can love you. I can care what happens to you. I can hope for you. I can pray for you. I can encourage treatment. I can celebrate your recovery. I can be heartbroken when you struggle and still understand. Your life belongs to you. That sounds obvious until it's someone you desperately want to save. Then it becomes one of the hardest truths in the world. Because sometimes love tells us to move closer. And sometimes healthy love requires us to stop doing what another adult needs to do for themselves. We're going to talk much more about rescuing and enabling in another Cycle Breaker episode because that deserves its own conversation. Today I'm talking about something underneath all of that. Who are you when you're not managing their addiction? That's a hard question. Maybe you don't know anymore, especially if this has gone on for years. Maybe you've been mom of the child struggling with addiction, dad trying to fix everything, the wife holding the household together, the husband watching his spouse disappear, the sibling everyone calls, the grandmother raising the grandchildren, the person who handles every emergency. And those roles become part of our identity. Then when the crisis stops, or when we finally stop participating in it, there can be this strange emptiness. What do I do now? That question deserves more attention than it gets. Because getting your life back isn't always immediately joyful. Sometimes it's uncomfortable. Sometimes peace feels strange when you've lived in chaos for years. We're going to talk about that later in this series too. But before we can become comfortable with peace, sometimes we have to remember who we are. What happened to you? Not what's happening with them. What's happening with you? When was the last time you asked yourself that? How are you sleeping? How is your health? When was the last time you laughed without immediately remembering something was wrong? Who do you talk to? What do you enjoy? What relationships have you neglected? What dreams did you put away? What have you stopped doing? What do you need? That last question can feel almost foreign. What do I need? We become so accustomed to asking what they need that we stop asking ourselves. Do they need food? A ride? Treatment? Money? Housing? A lawyer? Another chance? And somewhere in all those questions, we disappear. Getting yourself back isn't abandoning them. I really want loved ones to hear this. Going back to the gym isn't abandoning them. Going to dinner isn't abandoning them. Taking a vacation isn't abandoning them. Turning your phone off for a few hours isn't abandoning them. Laughing isn't abandoning them. Having relationships outside of them isn't abandoning them. Celebrating something good in your life isn't abandoning them. Going to counseling for yourself isn't abandoning them. Having dreams again isn't abandoning them. Living is not betrayal. You are allowed to have a life while someone you love is struggling with theirs. That doesn't mean you don't care. It means their addiction doesn't get to take two lives. Sometimes they won't like the change. This is another elephant in the room. When you've spent years being constantly available, fixing things, responding immediately, and arranging your life around someone else's needs, they may notice when you stop, and they may not like it. You've changed. Maybe you have. You don't care anymore. That's not necessarily true. You used to help me. Maybe the way you helped wasn't healthy for either of you. You're selfish. Maybe you're finally taking responsibility for your own life. And sometimes the person struggling isn't the only one who reacts. Other relatives may react too. Because when one person changes their role in a family, everybody else has to adjust. Cycle breaking can disrupt an entire system. That's not necessarily evidence you're doing something wrong. Sometimes it's evidence that something really is changing. This can happen outside addiction too. Remember, this Cycle Breaker series isn't only about addiction. You can lose yourself in almost any relationship. A romantic relationship, a friendship, a parent, an adult child, someone with constant crises, someone whose emotions always become your responsibility, someone you're constantly trying to fix, someone whose approval determines how you feel about yourself. Maybe you've spent your entire life being the person everybody depends on. Maybe you were taught that being needed meant being loved. Maybe saying no makes you feel guilty. Maybe taking care of yourself feels selfish. Maybe you've never known who you are outside of what you do for everybody else. That's a cycle too. And sometimes it started long before the relationship you're currently in. These beliefs can go back generations. I want to make this personal for a minute because when I look at my own family, I can see exactly how some of these patterns get passed down. My grandmother was one of the most important people in my life. And one thing she used to say that has stayed with me was, "You don't abandon your kids." She believed that. She lived it. And I understand more about where that belief may have come from now than I did when I was younger. Even right now, talking about it brings tears to my eyes because I just caught more of it. My grandmother experienced a devastating loss when one of her children drowned as a child. There were circumstances surrounding that loss that I believe left her carrying an enormous amount of grief and probably guilt. I can't tell you exactly what was happening inside of her because I'm not her. But looking back at our family now, I can see what happened afterward. She took care of everybody. Her children, me, my children. If somebody needed something and she could provide it, she did. Bills, money, things that probably should have been another adult's responsibility. She stepped in, again and again. And I don't believe she looked at that as rescuing. I think she looked at it as loving her family. That's important. Because when we're talking about generational patterns, we're not necessarily talking about somebody intentionally teaching us something unhealthy. Sometimes they teach us through the way they live. And what I saw was, you take care of your children no matter how old they are. If they're struggling, you help. If they can't pay something, you pay it. If they're in trouble, you step in. If they make a mess, you help clean it up. Because you don't abandon your kids. And honestly, I still believe you don't abandon your kids. But what I've had to learn is that there is a huge difference between not abandoning someone and taking responsibility for their life. Nobody taught me that difference. I had to learn it. And I had to learn it after repeating some of the same patterns myself. That's how family beliefs get passed down. Nobody handed me a rule book that said, "Christina, this is how you're supposed to lose yourself trying to save the people you love." I watched it. I absorbed it. It became part of what love meant to me. And when addiction later became a major part of my own family's life, what do you think I did? I stepped in. I helped. I rescued. I worried. I tried to fix. I carried things that weren't mine to carry. Because somewhere inside of me was this deeply rooted belief. That's what mothers do. And that's why I have so much compassion for loved ones who find themselves doing the same thing. Sometimes we're not just dealing with today's crisis. We're dealing with generations of beliefs about what love is supposed to look like. And there was another cycle running beside it. Alcohol was also so incredibly, deeply woven into my family. And that's something I can see much more clearly looking backward than I could while I was living inside of it. There were generations of heavy drinking. There were serious consequences from drinking. There were family members whose lives were dramatically affected by alcohol. But we didn't necessarily use the word addiction. Alcohol was alcohol. Drugs were drugs. And somehow, in a lot of families, those became two completely different categories. Someone could have a serious problem with alcohol and still look at somebody using drugs and think, well, I'm not like them. That's another cycle we're going to have to be willing to talk about. Because legal doesn't automatically mean healthy. And socially acceptable doesn't mean something isn't destroying a life. I was exposed to alcohol incredibly young. I was drinking as a young teenager. Adults around me drank. Alcohol was accessible. It was part of the environment I grew up in. And by the time I was technically old enough to legally buy alcohol for myself, drinking wasn't some new adult experience for me. I had already been doing it for years. Again, I'm not telling you that so we can figure out which person in my family deserves the blame. That's exactly what I'm trying to get away from. I'm telling you because I can now look backward and see a pattern that I couldn't see when I was standing in the middle of it. Alcohol, pain, loss, rescuing, silence, taking care of everybody, not talking about certain things, and another generation learning from the generation before it. Then something changed. Eventually, someone in my family became the first person to seriously stop drinking and seek ongoing recovery. And that's important to acknowledge too, because when we're examining generational patterns, we shouldn't only identify who passed something down. We should recognize the person who started changing it. That's cycle breaking. But stopping one behavior doesn't necessarily mean every unhealthy coping mechanism or family pattern automatically disappears. That's true for all of us. We can put down alcohol and still have work to do. We can stop using drugs and still have work to do. We can stop rescuing and still struggle with guilt. We can set a boundary and still feel horrible afterward. We can leave an unhealthy relationship and find ourselves attracted to the exact same dynamic in someone else. Sometimes the behavior we can see is only the top layer. Cycle breaking means eventually asking what was underneath it. What am I trying not to feel? What am I trying to control? What am I afraid will happen if I stop? What did I learn that love was supposed to look like? And what am I doing today simply because it's what I've always seen done? I had to redefine, you don't abandon your kids. That sentence from my grandmother is still with me. You don't abandon your kids. But today I hear it differently. Not abandoning my children doesn't mean I have to rescue them from every consequence. It doesn't mean I finance destructive behavior. It doesn't mean their crisis automatically becomes my crisis. It doesn't mean I stop living because they're struggling. It doesn't mean I have to destroy myself trying to keep another adult from destroying themselves. And it doesn't mean I love them any less when I finally say, this belongs to you. I love you, but I can't carry it for you. I can love my children without living their lives. I can be here without being consumed. I can care without controlling. I can support recovery without supporting addiction. And I can refuse to abandon myself while proving that I haven't abandoned them. That last part took me a long time to understand, because maybe that's another cycle nobody talks about. Generation after generation of people, especially mothers, being taught that loving everybody else means putting themselves last. Maybe our grandparents didn't have the language for boundaries. Maybe our parents didn't either. Maybe nobody taught us. But once we can see the pattern, we have an opportunity they may not have had. We can keep the love and change what we do in the name of it. That's what breaking the cycle looks like to me. So, maybe you learned this somewhere too. Maybe you watched your mother sacrifice everything for everybody. Maybe dad fixed everyone's problems. Maybe you were the oldest child and had responsibilities you shouldn't have had. Maybe keeping everyone happy kept your childhood home peaceful. Maybe you learned that your needs came last. Maybe you were praised for being the strong one, the responsible one, the helper. And those things aren't bad qualities. But even good qualities can become unhealthy when there are no limits. Being loving doesn't mean having no needs. Being dependable doesn't mean being available every second. Being strong doesn't mean never asking for help. And caring for people doesn't require disappearing inside their lives. So how do we start breaking this cycle? Not by suddenly becoming cold. Not by deciding, fine, I don't care anymore. That's not healing. We start by noticing. How much of my day revolves around someone else's choices? Notice how often you check, how often you worry, how often you rearrange your plans, how often their mood changes yours, how often you say yes when you want to say no, how often you neglect something you need because somebody else needs something. Don't judge yourself. Just notice it. Then start taking small pieces of your life back. Call somebody you haven't talked to. Go somewhere you enjoy. Restart something you stopped doing. Take care of your body. Make plans that don't depend on whether they're having a good day. Get support. Sit outside. Read. Walk. Create. Pray. Journal. Go to counseling if you need it. Do something that reminds you, I am still here. You don't have to stop loving them. That's probably the biggest misconception. People sometimes think detaching from someone else's addiction means becoming indifferent. It doesn't. You can love somebody deeply and stop making their choices the center of your existence. You can hope they recover without putting your life on hold until they do. You can answer the phone sometimes and not answer it other times. You can care about what happens without believing you control what happens. You can grieve what addiction has taken from them and still refuse to let it take everything from you. And if you're listening from the recovery side, maybe one of the greatest gifts you can eventually give the people who love you is permission to stop watching you every second. Not because they don't care, but because recovery eventually means taking responsibility for your own life. You don't need someone monitoring you forever, and they don't need to spend forever monitoring you. Both sides deserve freedom from that. Maybe this is your cycle to break. Maybe nobody ever told you that you were allowed to have a life separate from the people you love. Maybe generations of your family taught you that love means sacrifice. Maybe you watched people give and give and give until there was nothing left. Maybe addiction intensified something that was already inside you. The need to fix, the need to rescue, the need to be needed, the fear of letting go. You don't have to shame yourself for that, but you can recognize it. And you can decide, I don't want to live this way anymore. You don't have to wait for them to recover before you begin recovering pieces of yourself. You don't have to wait for their life to become stable before you create stability in yours. You don't have to wait for them to choose themselves before you choose yourself too. And choosing yourself doesn't mean choosing against them. That's important. This isn't you versus them. That's exactly what healing both sides is trying to move away from. Maybe the healthiest thing that can happen is for both people to start taking responsibility for the life that actually belongs to them. They work on theirs, you work on yours, and maybe someday you meet each other in a healthier place. Maybe you don't. But either way, you haven't disappeared, because loving someone should not require losing yourself. Before we end today, I want to leave you with something to think about. What part of this cycle belongs to you to break? Not your child's part, not your parents' part, not your partner's part, yours. Because we can spend years waiting for someone else to change before we allow ourselves to heal. But cycle breaking doesn't require everyone in the family to start at the same time. Sometimes it starts with one person who tells the truth, one person who gets help, one person who chooses recovery, one person who sets the boundary, one person who stops rescuing, one person who deals with the trauma, one person who says, I'm not carrying this forward anymore. And that person might be you. I thank you for joining me for another episode of our Cycle Breaker series on healing both sides. To connect, please visit ChristinaFoxAuthor.com. From there, you can explore my books, listen to the podcast, read the blog, subscribe to my newsletter, and connect with me across all of my social media platforms. And remember, you may not have started the cycle, but you can be the one who changes what happens next. I'll see you next time.